All right, everyone, welcome back to Systemic. I'm your host, Dan Kimbrough, and today I have with me Romain Muhammad, who is the founder of Diversify World, which is an agency in the UK that's looking at bridging DEI gaps between the corporate world and corporate and professional world and those in the country. And so the specialization is developing diverse talent from different backgrounds and working in corporate America so that they can actually have access to those means as well in the UK. And so today we're going to be talking about a research paper that you wrote that looks at the political and cultural effect of Africans in diaspora and sort of on the host countries that they have, and this notion that when we talk about African culture and the notion of how it's defined, we tend to think of the culture, if it's American African culture we're talking about, we think that America defines that. But the paper that you wrote asserts that whether it's Africa, the Caribbean, whether it's the UK, it's America, that it's less about the host countries' impact and influence so much as it is the resistance that Africans in diaspora have done that goes to define sort of that culture in that country. And so that's a big, broad topic. Let's sort of narrow that down. Talk to me a little bit about sort of this notion of the diaspora. And for most listeners, hopefully they understand that. But you being in the UK, you're looking at the diaspora very different than we do in the United States. So let's start there. What is this diaspora we're talking about?
Yeah, so I thank you for Dan for the introduction and having me on the podcast. I think it's a great topic that needs to be unearthed. It's a great topic that needs to be spoken about a lot more. This whole idea of diaspora is it's quite a new topic in that from an academic perspective, it's only really been discussed really over in the last sort of 20, 30, maybe 40 years. And the semantic definition of diaspora, what it means to have. From an African diaspora perspective, when we're looking at diaspora, it's key that we understand that it's not just one thing. The African diaspora isn't just one thing. It's a multiplicity of things and a multiplicity of different diasporas. Okay. Paul Gilroy speaks about the Black Atlantic, and what he basically posits is that the Black Atlantic is this creation of an African diaspora that really was created in the period of the transatlantic slave trade, which connected Africa to South America, to North America, back to Europe, and then back to Africa. And it's just almost this triangle trade. So when we think of the African diaspora, modern concepts of the African diaspora looks at this kind of triangular trade from Africa, and it connects all these other parts of the quote unquote the new world. However, one of the things that someone called Larson and Zazela, who are other academics, they speak about the hegemonic domination of the African diaspora from a US or from a Western perspective. And they say that when we're thinking about the African diaspora, we need to look further than that. So we need to think about the African diasporas that are also in the Middle East, the African diasporas that are also in South Asia. When we think about Pakistan, we think about places in like India. And when we think about there's Africans that are there now that we can Google, and we can go on YouTube and look at Africans that were taken to these places at a much earlier period. So what I mean when I talk about African diaspora, we need to be really specific about what African diaspora we're speaking about, or we will get in this kind of habit of looking at the African diaspora as one unchanging thing that is very New World or Western in its approach.
I agree. And I think that, and you bring up the triangle trade, and that's one of those things that in the U.S., if you talk about the African diaspora and the triangle trade, that's what we know. It's the idea of moving from Africa to North and South America and then back over to Spain, Portugal, and those areas, and this movement between the UK, Africa, and the Americas. And so that when we think diaspora, we think, oh, that's what we're talking about. And for us, it's even new that most people are still getting used to the idea of Afro-Latin. And so the idea that someone's, Afro-Cuban or Afro-Dominican, like this notion that, no, yes, they are from the DR, but they got there from Africa to begin with. And so that's one of the things that we're just now starting to understand. Central and South America have these African roots, but the argument is that that's one direction, but Africa was also sort of pillaged, and the diaspora went into many other countries as well. And so that if we're really going to be holistic, it's a global thing that we're talking about when we talk about the diaspora.
Yeah, I mean, and it depends how far you want to take it down. We could take it back even further than that, to the Neolithic period, and we can look at African diasporas in Europe, for example. There's a lot of some of the father, I would say, father academics, like people like Sheikh Anta Diop, Chancellor Williams, John Henrik Clark, and a number of other who I would say are the father academics, black Afrocentric academics who talk about the African diaspora that in places that we don't even think about it anymore. Like I said, our concept of it is very New Worldish, very Western, very
Mm-hmm.
post 16th century. However, there's a much earlier diaspora. I remember when I was doing my undergrad, I wrote a paper, and it was basically looking at talk about it was a good paper, but it was like years ago. It was basically looking at the Zanj rebellion in Iraq, Baghdad, and the
Mm-hmm.
Zanj. I've got the book somewhere here. Um, uh, so a lot of the primary sources came from this book called Al-Tabari, which is called The Revolt of the Zanj. Al-Tabari was an Arab historian that was to an extent somewhat contemporary to this period of time, and he looks at the rebellion and who the people were and why it happened, etc., etc. So that was what the
Mm-hmm.
paper was about. But the paper basically looked at the perceptions of Africans in medieval Islam or in medieval Arabic territories, etc. And that was around the 11th century. And these
Right.
Zanj were people who were taken, Africans who were taken from East Africa and taken in bondage and taken to Iraq to work, etc., etc., etc. And it looks at there, but that is another earlier example of a African diaspora, but it's in
Mm-hmm.
a completely different place. It's not as well known. It's not as well spoken about, and the amount of scholarship that's been done on this example of a African diaspora isn't as common, isn't as frequent as what we know for the African diaspora, for example, in the US. And that's another one of the challenges being a man of African descent in the UK. Even in the UK curriculum, when we think about civil rights, the civil rights movement, we're more likely to learn about the US context than the context that was in the UK. We had a civil rights movement here, and this this
Right.
this forms a part of my research and advocacy that I have, because it's not just about one of the things is about whitewashing history. That's one thing, but there's also this idea or this notion of offshoring history, which
Mm-hmm.
usually is an idea that you take history from one place almost to wash your hands of any agency that you had or involvement that you had in that history, and you put it to another place. America can't get away from its slave past because our ancestors, our forefathers that are American siblings, they were on American soil, okay, on plantations in America. Whereas Britain can do that very, very easily because its slave plantations were in Barbados or Jamaica or its colonies. Okay, so it can easily say, well, this didn't happen here, it happened over there. And it can easily say, well, it wasn't really government backed or government sponsored. These were independent individual organizations or slave traders. Okay, we didn't have any agency in it really, even though
Mm-hmm.
a lot of these people had um, uh, you know uh, whether it was licenses, etc., from the crown and stuff like this.
Right.
So this is the difference when we're looking at and went off a tangent there, but I get passionate. But
No,
this is
no.
the difference. This is the difference when we're thinking about diasporas. It's about
Mm-hmm.
what diaspora are we speaking about. We have to be very, very specific. There have been many, many different African diasporas, even longer than this Zanj rebellion, which was in the 11th century, Baghdad, Iraq. And we have to be very intentional about the diaspora in which we speak of, but also think about things need to be contextual and nuanced as well. As if we're talking about the UK African diaspora, there is so much solidarity and so much connection with our US counterparts that we don't even know. We don't even understand the connection sometimes. And it's almost like having a puzzle, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can only see the full picture of the puzzle once you put all the pieces together. And I think that's very similar to our experiences. Take the Eastern or Middle Eastern experience aside. We're looking at this Black Atlantic experience, as Paul Gilroy so eloquently put it. There are so many pieces to the puzzle that it needs to connect for us to see our greater kind of picture and discourse.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate that history and that background. And because when you talk about, especially again for you folks in the U.S., you specifically said, during that one in the 1100s, that Eastern Africa was where those enslaved individuals came from, and in the U.S. when we talk about enslavement, we don't think about Eastern Africa because for us it's Benin, it's Senegal, it's it's Ghana, it's the Western coast that is where the idea comes from. So this notion that it's been happening. A, for much longer than we understand, but B, it's this totality of Africa that it's very interesting that it took so long for us to get to this notion of understanding the idea of Pan-Africanism, which is something that you hit on in this paper, and this notion of if we're going to be able to discuss the diaspora, whether it's the 1100s, whether it's the 1600s, the notion of diaspora in general, we have to have a much wider lens and a broader scope because Africans exist all over the world. And for the most part, it wasn't by choice. And so this notion of coming to Africa and taking the greatest resource, which is African citizens, and using them as labor, as for agriculture and all these things around the world, it is a much bigger story than we are told here in the US, but also a much bigger story than you're told in the UK because you get, like you said, this offshoring where, well, whoa. We didn't do anything. That was the Barbados. That was Haiti. That was Jamaica. That's over there. The U.S. is where this is. It's a Western world problem, and I love that you bring that up. One of the universities I used to work at, we were on a trip to Jamaica, and we were visiting with a woman who was talking about the notion of the land that she had worked on. In that, while she was, growing mint and selling it in the local market, a large portion of what she sold went back to the UK because that's where her landlord was.
Yeah,
And this notion that in modern times in Jamaica, her rent is due, but it's not due to a Jamaican and it's not due in Jamaica. It's the notion that if she doesn't produce X amount of mint leaves, she could lose her land. And she tells us this because her son didn't want to continue anymore. So it was this notion of legacy, but also the land. If he doesn't continue to sell this mint, someone in the UK is going to say, well, someone else gets this land. And and that was 2010 that this is sort of still happening. And again, in Jamaica, we were there when we were visiting, and we learned about the borax mines and how a lot of the mining gets done and it gets sent to Canada, but then to buy the sheet aluminum back, they have to buy it back from Canada, even though it's mined there in Jamaica. But this idea of colonialism still existing where, yes, you may be the producer, but you're not producing it for yourself.
yeah,
There's this sort of invisible hand that's still on top of you. And so I appreciate this notion that A, it's still happening, but B, it was much larger than it is. And so let's switch to this idea that Pan-Africanism is sort of how we started to tackle this. We know Pan-Africanism here when we think of things like the notion of, Swahili is this Pan-African language. And for the U.S., Kwanzaa is considered this, it's an American holiday, but it's the idea that we're going to celebrate Pan-Africanism because we come from all over Africa. But your paper asserts that Pan-Africanism wasn't just sort of this global kumbaya. It was an actual asserted effort to sort of stand up to all of these places that had African citizens
yeah.
and give us a voice.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, it's a continue. When we look at these concepts as and theologies, not theologies, but these ideas of political ideas like Pan Africanism, what was so great about them is that they united or had this almost this 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 continuity of individuals, right? So we
Mm-hmm.
had people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who he spoke about things like double consciousness, which is this
Mm-hmm.
idea of, this ambivalence between home and belonging, or this ambivalence between a dual consciousness, sitting in between two cultures, which a lot of us here in the UK feel. Okay, not
Mm-hmm.
just now, but also over the last 100 years from the Windrush period, but even before, right? So we have people like that, and then we have almost this line, this lineage, okay, that went from W.E.B. Du Bois to Marcus Garvey to people like Amy Ashwood Garvey, who was really, really good friends with, people like Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first
Mm-hmm.
independent, democratically elected prime minister or president of Ghana, of an independent Ghana. So we have these connections of individuals that had this Pan-African ideology, but it wasn't just, like you said, a kumbaya moment and that we could all sort of sit and hold hands. It actually had political impetus, so much so that we see not organizations, countries being
Mm-hmm.
founded upon, or their independence being founded upon and rooted within Pan-Africanism. It wasn't just Kwame Nkrumah. We had Jomo Kenyatta also, who was at Pan-African Congresses. There was a Pan-African Congress in 1945 in Manchester, United Kingdom, and we had Jomo Kenyatta. We had someone called Ras McCannon. We had Amy Ashwood Garvey. We had who was the wife of Marcus Garvey, right? So
Mm-hmm.
when we start thinking about Marcus Garvey and his legacy, the United Negro Improvement Association, and how huge it was in the Black Star Line and all these huge concepts, his legacy is not just in that which he created. It
Right.
was the organization that it was the biggest, had the biggest black organization in apparently in the world, and had the biggest membership. His legacy is also in the people that he influenced, i.e., Amy Ashwood Garvey, and her legacy
Mm-hmm.
is in the people that she influences and what she passed down as well. So when we look at Pan Africanism, we see this movement that was continuous in its passing down of individuals, etc. But we see this
Mm-hmm.
movement that was actually politically successful. They had political success. When we think about its influence as well, its influence isn't just in its political legacy, but also in its spiritual and religious legacy,
Mm-hmm.
in that it influenced Rastafarianism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and what Rastafarianism has done, when we think about the UK context as such, Rastafarianism was a theological and spiritual um, enlightenment or reawakening, and that's in a way where a lot of black people or Africans in Britain were
Mm-hmm.
able to first hear their first conscious type of Pan African leanings. That's where they
Right.
was in. That's where they first heard about this slave master or colonialism or this or that and the system and etc. Systematic oppression, systematic racism. It was using Rastafarianism and reggae music as a
Mm-hmm.
vehicle, as a vessel. But that's a continuity or and a manifestation almost of Pan Africanism. So when we think about it, it's really interesting. It's really key that we don't just think about it as an idea or as a notion, but something that had political success, but also a reawakening and re-enlightenment of Africans, not just in the Caribbean, not just in Jamaica, for example, where it started, but in the UK. And then
Mm-hmm.
have also Rastafarianism in the motherland in Africa. There is
Mm-hmm.
there has been and there still is a growing movement of Rastafarians, and people that agree with the Rastafarianism movement and way of life. So I think Pan Africanism has been crucial and has been integral. I don't think it gets enough flowers. I don't think it gets enough recognition, um, because maybe it was unable, unfortunately, to go forward and to carry forth its political mobilization in Africa. And that's not necessarily the fault of those Africans like Jomo Kenyatta or Kwame
Mm-hmm.
Nkrumah, but as a result of intentional neo-colonial policies that sought to silence any kind of Pan-Africanist sentiment. And it's not just those initial people; those were, I guess, the pioneers some
Yeah.
of the African pioneers of it. But there were other people who espoused very, very similar views or very, very similar Pan-Africanist notions. Even people like Patrice Lumumba.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You could argue and say that he had an idea of Pan Africanism. So it goes on, and it's really pervasive.
Well, and I love that you bring up Lumumba because it's a great transition to where sort of I wanted to go. Was that when in reading your paper, it was interesting in that as you were talking about some of these different things and the idea of negritude and Pan Africanism
Yeah.
and these movements that are starting around the world, I keep mentally trying to figure out, all right, so for my listeners and for myself, how do I lynch this and sink this into American society somewhere where I understand it? And all I could think about was reading James Baldwin. And as I'm reading your paper, it's like, oh yeah, well, duh, because Baldwin was influenced by it. And so this notion that when we're talking about the reggae and the Rastafarianism and all these little movements, that part of what I think worked was that intentional disassociation of African communities. You know, the idea that here in the U.S. we know that manifests were destroyed, so most African Americans don't know what culture they come from.
Mm,
You know, like we can do a DNA test, but it's going to give us, a dart at a map, but we don't know because it was intentionally destroyed.
mm,
Or the notion that if you've got Africans in different parts of the world, they didn't take them all to one place; they were spread out. So like there is this disconnection to Africa as a whole, but you also don't know who you are within Africa.
Mm,
And so I love the idea that the Pan Africanism, we see it in America sort of pop up again with our James Baldwins, with our Langston Hughes. You know, the Harlem Renaissance movement is something that sort of comes out of that. But then you see James Baldwin much later on in the speeches that he's giving and talking around the world, that he's speaking globally to Africans while talking to us in the US about the civil rights movement. And I think that that's important because those are the names we know. But Bobby Sykes, who's someone that you bring up in the paper, who's Aboriginal, you know, from Australia, who gets involved in our Black Panther Party movement here in the United States,
exactly.
who has direct influence on Bobby Seals and Fred Hampton.
Right.
And when we think about the People Party here in the United States, it really is a replica of this notion of this Pan-African movement, because it wasn't just Pan-African. It then becomes looking at all marginalized individuals. So how do Africans and Asians work together in communities where they are considered, you know, the lower end of that spectrum and they've been colonialized? Or how do the Africans and these individuals? And so it Pan Africanism leads into this almost sort of globalized movement of minorities and underrepresented people saying, we got to say something. We need to
Yeah.
stand up, and we don't have to be alone anymore because we have brothers and sisters in arms.
Yeah. And that's the point that the paper makes in that kind of put a section of Black Power and Political Blackness. Um, I
Mm-hmm.
might actually publish this paper, Dan. You're inspiring me to publish. Um,
You
you
should.
know,
People need to read this.
no, 100%. And actually, I've got a book coming out called "The Others We Became." Um,
Mm-hmm.
Home, identity, and belonging in post-war Britain. But part of what the book talks about is it looks at almost three parts of the the African diasporic journey in post-war Britain. Okay, it
Mm-hmm.
looks at from 1940, and this has no bearing on the presence of Africans before 1948. There has been presence of Africans for at least a 10,000 year period, and
Right.
that's another conversation with people like Cheddarman. And
Mm-hmm.
a number of Africans that came with the Romans and came with the Vikings, etc. There's another conversation. But what the book looks at is the from 1948 to 1971, almost this. There was the initial Windrush period, okay, which is the Windrush
Mm-hmm.
generation, which was from 1948 to 1971, as I mentioned, and it was because of the British Nationalities Act in 1948, which basically said that anyone who was a British citizen or anyone who was a British subject, sorry, a British subject
Mm-hmm.
in any of the British colonial metropole, so Jamaica, for example, could come to the colonial metropole, the motherland, the mother country, for example, and work. Right. So my grandma came here, my maternal grandma, who is basically the inspiration and the motivation for all of my work. Right. She's the person that it's an ode to her. But not just her, all her contemporaries, but her specifically. So
Yeah.
she came
I
in,
appreciate you sharing that.
yeah, no, 100%. So she came in 1961 as a 17, 18-year-old girl. But that generation were very bought into the idea of the British state, of the Queen, and of the um, British patriotism, and that they really actually believed that they would, and they had hope, and they believed that
Mm-hmm.
actually be able to make a life for themselves here, and they would be treated with justice, freedom, and equality, and equity, and inclusion because they were British subjects. But when they got here, they realized actually that was that that was far from the experiences that they would have had. Okay, so there was a lot of things that were happening and etc. But in my no, that's not, and this is not to take agency away from them. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
but in my observations, this is just my humble observations. We might get someone that will completely disagree with me. That's completely fine. But in my humble observation, the way in which they reacted and responded to that was a lot more passive.
Mm-hmm.
It was a lot more, and they, don't get me wrong, there was resistance and there was etc. And but it was a lot more passive in comparison to their children.
Right.
And their children grew up, and I would say in this second part of the book is called resistance. That part is called hope, the first part. The second part is called
Gotcha.
resistance, and that is from 71 to 1971 to the late 80s, and that's a period of genuine resistance, genuine resilience, genuine agency in that redefinition of identity, but also blackness. This is
Right.
the period. this is the period of time that we get this idea, this concept, that is very, it's quite a British thing, and it's where an author, an academic called John Narayan, says that the British concept of black power, had got its British accent from. That's where it got its British
Mm-hmm.
accent. And this was an idea called political blackness, okay? And which was an idea that everybody who wasn't white, essentially, was
Right.
politically black. So we had Asian people from Pakistan, from India,
Mm-hmm.
from Sri Lanka, from Bangladesh, all identifying politically as black, whilst not nullifying their ethnic or religious or cultural nuances and specific cultural experiences and ethnic experiences. They would identify as politically black. Okay, which would mean that you might go to a protest, okay, and it might be a Black Panther, a British Black Panther protest, because we had many here. Okay, there was a
Yeah. Yeah.
whole chapter, multiple chapters of the British Black Panthers, but also the British Black Power movement. Okay, here that had a lot of successes also. And you would see in those protests, in those movements, in those meetings, people of Asian descent. There are some
Yeah.
people that are really, really well known. Some people like Avtar Bra, who were very, very well known. She was actually a professor at Birkbeck University of London. So this idea of using, or this idea of resistance, and in its many forms, and it being able to unite disparate groups with different experiences under one banner, creating a level of solidarity, um, and shared experience based on what they were facing in Great Britain, or Britain, was very, very real in this period of time. And I think it's something that we could take from now. Now we are
Mm-hmm.
very, very, not just in the UK, but across the globe, we're very disparate in the way in which we interact with issues, situations. You know, it might be based on racial lines or ethnic lines. It might be based on cultural lines. It might be based on religious lines. Okay,
Right.
wherein you might be something might be happening over there, but because we're so far away from it, and because the person doesn't look like me racially, I don't care. However, in this
Right.
period of time, it was the complete opposite. Oppression was oppression, no matter who was facing it. So you would regularly see some of the members of the Black Power movement, again, which was formed of many, many, many different subgroups and sub movements, etc. They would be protesting for the Irish liberation
Right.
in London, in Trafalgar Square in the 70s. They're protesting for in support of it. So it was this
Mm-hmm.
umbrella, this cross solidarity of different movements and different individuals that were all for justice and freedom.
And I love that because it speaks to the agency of the host country. And when you really look at it historically, the goal was always to never let that happen. And that it happened in the UK is amazing because here in the US, and it's funny, I was telling the story the other day. The last time I was called the N word was by an indigenous individual because I used to live in the Pacific Northwest here. And when you think of the salmon runs and historically issues of, the Trail of Tears in the United States, where we take all of the indigenous population and we push them onto the West Coast and
Mm,
they're forced to work in the salmon runs. Well, then you also have your enslaved population that you're making to work for free, which is technically cheaper labor. And so now you're creating amongst marginalized groups this intra-conflict
yeah,
over jobs and housing and all these things that are still issues, but you're forcing now these groups to fight amongst themselves. And it's almost that offshoring of whitewashing of, well, we didn't do anything. It's you all who are fighting. So in modern day times, the last time that I hear that is from someone who's brown skinned. And I'm like, what?
yeah,
We're on the same team,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah,
a lot of countries
yeah.
work advantageously to make sure that there's separation and that there's division, that it's your block versus
Yeah.
this neighborhood. And in the US, we saw a lot of retaliation. In Philadelphia, there was the move party that gets bombed in Philadelphia. And a lot of what they were pushing for was this notion of unifying all of these different groups. Fred Hampton's assassination comes because he's trying to get the Poor People's Party to work with the Black Panther Party, to work with indigenous individuals, to work with different unions And it's
Yeah.
that level of synergy that really terrifies people in
Yeah.
power, because it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. If they all realize that we're the bad guy, things go crazy. And so that you were able to achieve it and do it for so long in the UK is amazing, because most other countries didn't have that.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that you guys had that FBI COINTELPRO.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I think I'm saying it wrong, and it was this fear of a black messiah, um,
Yeah.
and there were many potential black messiahs, and they were dealt with in the way in which
Yeah.
the program and was looked at dealing with them. I think in the UK, from not from the knowledge that I have, there was no black messiah, no fear of the black messiah. But what there was, and it wasn't any. I'm not saying there was any spying going on and infiltration and
Right.
things
Yeah.
like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm saying that it wasn't done in that same way. But what you do see is that the way in which, for example, the political blackness was dismantled, it was funding. So if you was to look at you was to be a community organization, you would have
Mm-hmm.
to specify specifically who you were and what you were trying to do. So it couldn't
Gotcha.
be for black people, etc. Association. It had to be done on ethnic lines, religious lines, even ethnic group lines. So that's why from the Asian context, you might see the Gujarati, etc. association. And that was the only way you could receive funding, is if it was very, very nuanced and very, very um, very, very specific in who you were and what
Yeah.
you were doing. And what that did is, obviously, what it did is it created these pockets of marginalization within marginalized groups.
Right.
And also, when you take funding from bodies, local authority or government bodies, you are susceptible to not just changes and shifts and pivots in policy, but also
Mm-hmm.
there is censorship,
Yeah.
right? And not just that. So that was one aspect of this censorship, or this reduction of this political blackness, and reduction of this cross marginalized people solidarity. But there were the way in which the state would operate with different groups was very, very different. So, for example, for black people, or for people of African descent, their main qualm with the state was over policing and police brutality, right? So you would have um, policies like the sus laws, which was
Mm-hmm.
a law which was basically said that police could stop you, arrest you, and charge you on the mere suspicion that you were doing a crime,
Right.
right? So what it did was it criminalized the whole generation of particularly black men from from the Caribbean and from other parts of the diaspora, Africa, etc. It criminalized a whole generation of black men, but it also made our fight very, very targeted and specific to police brutality. Whereas in the Asian context, their fight was more against immigration, people being forcibly removed from this country, um, and also limiting their ability to come to this country, even though they were British subjects and essentially British citizens. So what
Mm-hmm.
you would have is two people, two groups, two races, two ethnic groups previously under one banner fighting the same fight. Now their vision and attention is separate. You've got one group looking at police brutality and protesting against police brutality, okay,
Mm-hmm.
and then the subsequent riots that had happened in Britain in in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even up to recently, being focused on police brutality from a black perspective, but from an Asian
Right.
perspective, their resistance and resilience is towards immigration. So you separate the solidarity by
Right.
by giving people a lot of things to by clouding their resistant spirit, basically, in a sense.
Yeah.
Whilst all the other things are going on when it comes to funding, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think in modern times we're starting to get to this point where we realize that it's, white supremacy is the issue, right? It's this notion of fighting against sort of that, and I think in the UK it's fighting against the idea of colonialism, because what I think that's interesting that people in the US don't get is when you talk about the idea of the British subjects being able to come home is a very interesting thing because it's almost a delineation of the slave trade because the idea that if you were enslaved in Africa and you somehow ended up at a British colony, we're redefining home for you by saying you get to come home, but home is the UK. It's not where you came from originally.
Mm,
But in the idea that coming home as well, we're inviting you back as the government, but no one asked the people. And so that again that dual citizenship, which makes it easy to do this now, because now we're saying everyone come home, come back to the UK, and the easiest way to disrupt the solidarity is that in doing so allow groups to figure out their own issues. And so now while the issue of police brutality and immigration still comes back to the British state, I'm going to fight it on my own over here, and you fight it on your over there, and we split our resources, and we're divesting all these things. It's like whoa, whoa, whoa. Well, now there's 5 people fighting this and 10 people fighting this, as opposed to 15 people and
exactly.
all of our
Fine.
money collectively fighting the exact same people. Because at the end of the day, your problem with police brutality and immigration are the same people. But as long as we don't see that,
Mm,
we will never be able to stand back up. And so it's again, it's interesting the notion that like we have a roadmap. We know that it's this idea of solidarity. It's the idea of having a unique voice, even though it's all very different. Because
mm,
as you're talking about the struggles in the UK, they mirror exactly what's happening in the US.
100%. And we know
It
about.
they're
No,
Go
go
ahead,
for it, Dan.
go ahead.
Go, no, 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 you go for it, Dan.
I'm saying, and it's the idea that they're mirroring, and so yes, on the one hand, we need global solidarity or whatever country you're in, looking at marginalized populations and saying, hey, we're fighting the same person. We can each fight our battles, but if we fight
Mm,
it together, that works. And it's worked in the past, and it'll work in the future. But there's also the similarity of the notion of music, in that it was reggae that was the voice of these individuals in this marginalized groups that sort of helped solidify it in the U.S. It's the soul music in the 60s and 70s. It's the
mm,
gospel and blues and jazz of the 30s,
right,
40s, and 50s.
right, right,
And
right.
so wherever you go, it's the notion that there's this music that becomes a voice for people that don't have a voice.
Yeah,
It's the notion that realizing that, oh, well, your troubles are my troubles are your troubles. Maybe if we come together, and knowing that at some point, whether it's COINTELPRO or it's reduced funding or it's redlining, that there's going to be this pushback to try to keep people separated, but that is the answer. It's this idea of the notion of solidarity and pulling
yeah,
together. How
yeah.
do we get there, though? How do we move to a point where we can look at all of our issues and say, hey, we're working together? Because, and before you answer, I want to point out some of the paper in your paper, sort of this thing that you start off talking about how Europeans, and it wasn't just Europeans, it was all over the world, the push that Africans, and if we use Africans as a vehicle for all marginalized groups, are inferior, they're less intelligent, blah 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 blah. There's a reason there are forced labor force, right? But then you end the paper and you talk about the idea that there's this unique and cultural political expression that comes out of having Africans or marginalized groups in all of these countries now. That it's no longer the notion that, oh, well, they're not intelligent, so we don't need to worry about it, we can do all these things. Well, you underestimated how many different groups and how many rebellions, how many times is the British, I mean, of all countries that have an Independence Day against them, the UK wins that one, and so it's like more countries have said we're done with the UK than any other country, right?
Yeah.
And so clearly, there's the idea of the unique political expression in this cultural resistance. It's just an interesting notion that we go from, well, those people don't matter, they're not intelligent, they don't, we can do whatever we want with them, to now, damn,
Yeah,
like, because we did that,
yeah,
now you're dealing with Black Panther parties across
yeah,
the globe.
yeah,
And it was because you chose the idea of inequity. You
yeah,
chose forced labor, and you did this to
yeah.
individuals. How do we get back to remembering that, like, our solidarity is how we kept moving forward?
It's about, and that's a great question, and I love the way you summed it up as well. Thank you for that. It's really, really key. I think it's about having open and honest conversations like this, and I think that's the
Mm-hmm.
start, right? And it's about trying for us to, and we are, no matter where we go, because of the pervasive social, political, and economic issues and state we have as Africans, but also
Mm-hmm.
as all oppressed and marginalized people in the host country, for example, because we're all going through very, very similar things. Sometimes it's very, very hard for us to take a step out of the box and recognize when we're in survival mode,
Yeah.
right? A lot of us are in survival mode. So it's about, we don't want to upset the status quo. We don't want to upset our job and our boss because we know we're still in survival mode. So we need to wait for that paycheck to come. Um,
Yeah.
at the right? But and that's the challenge. That is the challenge, and that has been, in my opinion, one of the failed concepts, or the spillovers or the tensions of policies, of failed policies of multiculturalism, failed policies of political correctness, and failed policies of assimilation. Is that when you
Hmm.
erode a problem, or a problem cause, or the cause of a problem, or who's caused the problem, when you erode that, and you put the blame on the oppressed, and shift it from the person in which who has oppressed the oppressed, you create
Hmm.
this issue where we can't actually look at and find the problem because we don't have the capacity to, because we're in survival mode. Okay, so I
Yeah.
think that's the overarching issue that we a lot of us have, regardless of which color our passport is, or what flag we have on our passport. It's that issue. But I think
Hmm.
going to take is not one person, but it's going to take us to have conversations like this where we're able to sit down and say, look, what's happening in the UK is very, very similar to what's happening in France. And it's also what's very similar to what's happening to the Pacific Islanders and the
Hmm.
native people in places like Australia and New Zealand. When you look at all the social indicators, so discrimination, racism, access to education,
Hmm.
access to resources, wealth redistribution, social mobility, blah 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 blah. It's the same. They have the same challenges over there as us, albeit their skin complexion might be a little bit lighter and their hair texture might be a little bit straighter. But it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Okay. So when we start trying to make linkages for all
Hmm.
oppressed people over the world, and actually say, look, we are in the same boat. And there might be, don't get me wrong, in America, for example, and even here, there is a growing black middle class, there's a growing African American middle class in places like Atlanta, etc., etc. But
Yeah. Yeah.
that doesn't mean the vast majority of African Americans in America aren't going through the same things that the vast majority of Black Caribbean or Black African. That's the way
Right.
they call it in the UK, or Black British is
Hmm.
another category. There's four categories in the UK. You've got Black African, you've got Black Caribbean, you've got Black British, and you've got Black Other. Okay,
Got.
that's the way
Wow.
they
Okay.
that's the way they break down their ethnic categorization here. But that doesn't mean that the
Gotcha.
vast majority, and there is a growing middle class here as well, and upper class, and people doing great things or whatever, whatever. But that doesn't mean that the vast majority of black people, not just black people, all marginalized and underrepresented groups in the UK are going through the same thing. But what it is that if I become a millionaire or a billionaire tomorrow, do I forget about everybody else?
Right.
And that's what sometimes happens, is that we forget, we move out of the area that we would call it the ends over here. I know you guys would call it the
Hmm.
projects or the hood over there, but we move
Yeah.
out
Yeah.
of these areas, understandably, to an extent. I understand why, I understand the sentiment around it. Okay, that you move out and you move somewhere completely country or completely rural, right, and you then
Yeah.
disconnect from who you are and what you are and where you are from. But it's not about moving out and bringing people, or moving out and trying to still do for that community. We try to move out and completely disassociate ourselves. Okay? So
Yeah.
then what you have is these individuals who have made it successful, but they forget about everybody else and forget about the vast majority. So it's about always remembering where we've come from, regardless of the success that we have given have been given have had, we have now.
Yeah.
And it's about having open and honest conversation. It's about seeing ourselves in other people, because today it's them, but tomorrow it could be us.
Right. Right.
And it usually is the case, right? Today it's
Hmm.
them, but
Hmm.
tomorrow it's us, or today it's us, tomorrow it's them. And understanding that, and a lot of people, even in the UK, there's this whole discussion around immigration, Rwanda. There was a Rwanda policy where the British government were trying to take illegal immigrants and put them in Rwanda. And you have a lot of discussions from people whose grandparents and parents were once immigrants, and they
Yeah.
almost support that policy. And sometimes I look at them very, very funny and strange and say, but you were also, your family, your grandparents were also immigrants. So today it's these people, but yesterday, last week, last it was you. So how can you have
Right.
this, right? So it's about trying to get rid of that by open, honest conversations and just seeing ourselves as part of a global network of oppression, systemic global oppression. I think that's where we need to get back to.
Yeah. A few side notes. One, the funny thing, something that you said that was interesting is the I have lost it now. The idea, well, no, just the notion that there's so much of the division in the little things, and in the U.S. it's such a different society sometimes, and it's weird to think about how just the way that our government is set up and the way that because we have states as opposed to colonies, or like we're not spread out, we're all in one place. It's just interesting that you have these different categories of Black Caribbean and Black British and this and that, and we're just all either Black or African American because we've been so diluted we don't even get to the point that we're talking about sort of countries of origin.
Mm,
And there are a lot of like Afro Latinos, like I said, that they do know, but there's that weird difference, right? Like my family is here from the diaspora in the 1600s. So like I don't have that linkage back to Africa
mm,
other than the notion that we're Black. But then you have individuals who moved here on their own or were moved here separately. Whereas in the UK, it's a very different model where that linkage and understanding sort of where you came from originally is embedded in your Blackness. And so it's interesting to hear you talk about it because that's not the consciousness that we have here.
mm,
And there's all these movements and pushes at different
mm,
times to try to get to that point of reconnecting with Africa at a much more personal level. But then people go, well, but don't forget we still have this global issue to worry about.
mm.
And so it's that push and pull of how do we do it all. So it's encouraging to hear that, again, while you have more categories that sound different and weird to us in the US, but you're still having those because again, and the argument here is always, well, my African American or I'm Black. And like I think we've sort of finally got to a point that Black is people who have African blood. That's all you need to know. African American for us tends to be those from that diaspora in the 1600s. That's sort of the idea of the African American, but like we're sort of alluded that that's where we get in the conversation. We can't even get
Mm.
beyond that. And I love that for the UK and for other countries in general that it's different than that, and that you're having different conversations. It sucks that we're still having the conversations,
No.
but that there's the idea that the identity is such a different piece, and so I think it's just interesting to think about identity is different based on that country that you're in and how you view it because here and because also in the UK because you know where you come from the different amount of accents it's a British Nigerian or it's a British this or it's a British Jamaican accent so like
Yeah.
it's so different whereas in here we don't have those things and
Yeah.
so it's that level of diversity while it's still under oppression is so much more lively. I almost feel that sometimes I get jealous. I'm like, man, how amazing would it be to have that culture? It sucks that we're still all oppressed, but like there's so much more culture that exists
Yeah,
around it over there.
there is, but one of the things about identity and culture, and that it's not this. It's hybridized and it changes and it moves and it
Right.
shifts, right? So there has been, and that speaks to the resistance and the resilience of Africans globally. And if we look at
Mm-hmm.
you guys, you yourself, our African siblings, and you guys have been able to create an African American culture that is unique to you. Okay,
Right.
even in the food, in some of the food ideas, even some of the kind of marital rights, hopping over the broom and things like this, which we see, which we see on some of the African American movies. You've been able to create something it's very unique to you, and that's the thing about identity and culture that it
Mm-hmm.
changes, not just based on the host country, wherever the host country is, but the agency
Yeah.
those Africans and the resilience of those Africans and other oppressed peoples. For example, case in point, Jamaica, for example. I'm from Jamaica. Well, my grandparents are from Jamaica. I was born here. But what you still find, especially I'm second generation, right? My mom was born here.
Mm-hmm.
My grandma was born there. My mom was born here. I was born here. I'm second generation. So what you then find is that this ambivalence between home and belonging. Where is
Yeah.
actually home? Okay. When I go to Jamaica, I'm told I'm English. I'm British. Okay, because I'm English boy, British boy. That's what they would say to me,
Right.
right? But when I'm here, I'm reminded that I'm definitely not English. That's not even a category. That's not even a discussion. Okay, we know that. But then the Britishness is posited against whether you're African or Caribbean or other.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, black other or black British other or whatever it is, right?
I can't. That's wild. I think we finally have moved away from other as a category, but that's yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, right. So then there's that. Okay, so you're being told even in your ethnic categorization on forms, you are told that
Hmm.
you might be British, but there is or black, sorry, but there's something else to you. You're Caribbean,
Yeah.
you're African, so you're then otherized, etc. Right? But then also in the news or in this representation, as Stuart Hall talks about it, as talks about the representation or representation of ideas in the news, the media, politicians, government policy, even in sports.
Right.
A couple of years ago, there was the Euros, and England was in the final against Italy, I believe it was, and it was a penalty shootout. Could have won for the first time in, I think, first time in ever. The last time England was won a major football tournament or soccer tournament, you guys call it, was in 1966. 1966, right? So they nearly was in the final, and it was penalty shootouts, and all of the players that missed were black players, were players of African descent, right? And if you that night there was black people being attacked in train stations, on the streets. There was online trolls, racially abusing,
Wow.
verbally racially abusing not just the players but black people as a whole. Okay, so
Wow.
it's even pervasive and obvious in sports that when you are doing
Yeah.
well, we will claim you. You can be British, but when you are not, when you do something bad, you're the other. You're an immigrant. You're an N word. You're this. You're that, etc.
Yeah.
Now our generation have this ambivalence between home. What home is? Where is home? Is it the
Hmm.
Caribbean? Is it where our grandparents came from? Is it Africa? And or is it here, which is the country that
Yeah.
we know more than the others? But because of these reminders, these constant reminders, we feel like the lack of belonging, like we don't belong anywhere.
Right.
So
Right. Which goes back to that the dual citizen, the dual consciousness
the dual
idea.
consciousness, yeah, the idea W.E.B. Du Bois idea, and he mentioned this idea 100 plus years ago, and it's so relevant for me as a second generation, um,
Yeah.
Jamaican man here of African descent in the UK. There's so many different
Yeah.
identities, but yeah, that's how we feel. So it's shifted. For example, I'm gonna stop here. My grandma, for example, she when she came here, she was her and her contemporaries, they identified themselves as West Indians.
Hmm.
That's what they were called. They call themselves West Indians,
Right.
right? We don't use that term anymore, unless really
Right.
that term is not used. But even within the difference of identity, we can see it along generational um,
Yeah.
lines, where different
And
generations
it's
are different.
We'll wrap up after this, but it's funny that you say that because and I think this wraps it. This is a good way to sum it up. Of your paper you're talking about is that the idea that West India was a category of designation is the host country's error because Columbus didn't make it to India. So the notion that we were calling individuals West Indian who were from the Caribbean,
Right.
like I think this really sort of is a good way to sum it up, is that idea that like the identity of folks from a diaspora has to come from the folks from a diaspora. Because if not, you are literally miscategorized because like you're not in India. Therefore, how are you West Indian? Well, that's because the host countries were the people that came up with the identity. And when you remove that and you allow people to actually, oh, wait, we're Caribbean, Afro Latino, oh, not West Indian because India is over there. And so like this
Absolutely.
is not that, so I think it's a great way to sort of wrap it up in the idea that and again I love that the paper is the idea that it's the unique voice of folks in diaspora that has to be what defines them, because through that the resistance and being able to stand up and all those things comes out of that, but it comes out of their own definition. And so the idea of resistance, you said that's the second part of your book. I want to give you a little time. Talk to me about the book that's coming out.
Yeah. So we spoke about the first part, Hope, which is 1948 to. So the book's called The Others We Became: Identity,
Mm-hmm.
Belonging, um, Identity, Home, Identity, and Belonging in Post-War Britain. It's broken down into three sections. The first section is called Hope, which really looks at my grandmother's experience from 1948 to 1960 to 1971. It's an
Mm-hmm.
era of hope. They really thought they was gonna have the level of uh, equity and identity that they, because based on being British citizens and British subjects, they were so wrong. Okay, so that looks at
Yeah.
that,
Right.
their experiences, how they navigated, etc. Then we look at the second part of the book, which is that resistance piece, which is from
Mm-hmm.
1971 to the late 80s, early 90s, where their children now not wanting to, not being willing to take the discrimination or racism or inequality lightly, looks at how they interacted with the British state, how they interacted with everything that was going on, what did they do, and how did their identity and concepts of home and belonging change based on
Mm-hmm.
that. And then we look at the third part of the book, which is actually called ambivalence.
Okay.
And that part of the book looks at from the early 90s up until now. And that's kind of like my generation, where we feel like we're not British. We're not really British, or maybe we have a British passport, so we're British passport holders, or we're British citizens to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, depending on what you do and what you don't do, but you're not really British, or you're definitely not ethnically British. Yeah,
Right.
so, but you might not also be wherever in which you, or you might not feel like you're from wherever which your parents or grandparents from. So then, how do we now navigate this weird
Yeah.
myriad of ideas and of notions of these home identity and belonging? And what is the future for us? You know, do we
Yeah.
start reclaiming identities of our parents and our grandparents? Will we start calling ourselves West Indians again? Will we start just saying black? Okay,
Right.
are we going to drop the black British and the you know, what is next for us? How are we? What are we gonna do in terms of going forward? So that essentially is the book and the way I deal with the different time periods.
All right. Well, I look forward to it. I will definitely make sure I pick up a copy. So, Romain, if folks want to get a hold of you, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, so you can follow me on LinkedIn. It's Romain Muhammad on LinkedIn, Instagram, Romain Muhammad on Instagram. Drop me an email, Romain at diversifyworld.com. Yeah, would love to connect with anyone who wants to connect.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much, Romain. This has been Systemic, and we'll talk to you next time.